I think Houston Post is one of them. Yeah. But he has a really good sense of Bush. We had Dan Bartlett, then we had Dan Bartlett and Mike Curry together. They were a nice combination. We had Alexis with David Sang. We had Rick Marcus, and talking about the editorial process as well as the company White House. Peter Baker.
She's very nice.
Right, she does, yeah. She has a couple of girls. And she seems to like
I hear she was really good friend. She did a good job. She's a very good friend of mine.
yeah, very thorough. She's very thorough with her
She's also, she's an editorial right now.
Yeah, she does presidency pieces. She does budget stuff.
I usually go back to the public, but I didn't this time. It's like, you know why? I didn't know why. The problem is I go to the mission, different people come up, and other people say, oh, you didn't come over to see me, and I feel, so it's like it's sort of, I'm not particularly Wilkian, but I sort of do have a reason not wanting to go off and get
Yeah.
I don't do that. When I was
Okay. All right. One thing, our website is not working either.
2 seconds.
No, I'm just saying our ucdc.edu is not working at all. Okay, no problem.
Okay.
Bye.
So, great. Yeah, all right. Is this to you? Can I just get the mark?
We also had Carl Road. The road required that we get off the record. Yeah.
Well, you probably,
Remember, you were here for Road? How'd you like it?
I thought it was really interesting.
Hmm?
I don't know. The first time I started listening to trading, I felt like I was being reached too far behind
Well, I think he's been very involved in the whole selling process, which is, I like the part where he's talking about.
I'm ready, Martha, whenever you are.
How you got interested in history. And Nicole Devlin, she comes from California, who is the director of communications now at the White House. And did a campaign. But then a reporter.
Why isn't the email working?
Diane is working on it. Something is, wow.
She's a director of communications. She runs communications for the White House.
what is this class?
It's called White House Communications for Effective Officials and Reporters. And it came about last year. I had a grant, and in the process of writing a grant, that we figured out what would get money. Vice Chairman said we should make some of the money should go not just for research but for a class, an interactive class. I said, what would an interactive class be like? He said, well, you need to do something with the University of Maryland or the College of Art. And so I came to Popularity because I once spoke for a session he had from UC Davis. He would come here every month in our studio, plays videos, interview somebody, and his students back in so then he said, oh, do it here, and so I just ended up, instead of doing a couple sessions, I did 13. And Pearl did a really nice one. It was after the Correspondence Association Day. but I worked between my master's and my doctorate. I worked at NBC in New York. So I was somewhat interested in media from there. And when I was in college, I went to Oregon and I worked for somebody you may have known. His name was Travis Frost. Yeah, he was. So I worked for him the summer between my junior and senior year. And yeah, we became good friends.
Very close.
What's up? Hello? Yeah. Trying to get these people attention. They don't know the lady who's doing this White House communication. Yeah, our website is not even working, so I don't know, we can't do it live. Well, we're doing it live, but it's not going.
It's set off a firestorm.
Yeah, everything is down.
And then also...
Huh? Yeah, they're doing it. They're about to do it now. It's supposed to start at 6.
Get her to see the light.
So, just trying to get her attention, but she's not looking at me. So what are you doing tonight? Why? You're a workaholic. Can I hire you in my company? Well, you work late. That means you, well, nah, you do more personal stuff sometimes than you work. If I hire you, I'll be monitoring you. You might be working. Yeah. That's what I was scared when I was applying for new jobs. That I'm gonna get something that my time is like I have to be somewhere on time and I can't do what I want to do. After I had my office, that's when things started calming down. That's after I had my office when that lady stopped monitoring me. Yeah, my capable. Did you fill out that thing? You did said the same thing before. Yes, you did. That's exactly what you said. So I'm about to do it right now. Reserve it. Pay for it, yeah. So, well, that's the same thing. Okay. Yeah. And I want us to go to the mountains of Virginia. I heard people talking about good things around there. Good things about the mountains. You ready?
Everybody?
Hold on one second. Let me call you back.
We're ready to go.
Okay, turn your cell phones off, and we're going to Remember my class, I was in Silver Down, I took the email to the White House, tomorrow we have a holiday here, 9/11 Commission, so we're coming here at 6 o'clock, discussing the
Here, let's see, you can
Very
put it,
good.
yeah, you can put it,
Where do you want this?
you just put it here.
Whatever you want.
All right.
You just do it. How's that? Good evening. This is our final White House communications course from the perspective of officials and reporters. And we're very lucky this evening to have Lou Cannon, who can give us some perspective on the changes that have occurred in the coverage of the White House and also some of the changes that have occurred in the news.
You've reached the UC Washington Center Telecommunications Support
We
Line.
covered politics in California, covered Reagan in California, and covered him at the White House, and was known as the best correspondent, the most thorough and up-to-date on whatever was going on in the White House during the Reagan years. And if you wanted to know what was really happening, you read Lou Cannon, which I remember doing. And you did a wonderful job.
Thank you, Martha.
Can you tell us what it was, how you first covered Reagan, where you began your coverage of him, and kind of how you got into the business?
Well, there's a lot of accidents in this business, and my son Carl Cannon, who has been here and works for White House Correspondent, National Journal, said once that you didn't choose you didn't choose Reagan, Dad. It chose you. I was working for the San Jose Mercury News in 1965, and went to. They had a dispute about who would be their Sacramento correspondent. I was the compromise candidate, and I had applied for the job, and went up there, and Reagan came along, and the first about, I don't know, a few weeks into this, one of my editors asked me to go over and see this guy named Ronald Reagan who was speaking. It wasn't even an assignment, you know. It was a lunch, and it was a free lunch, so you know you got to eat lunch. And I went over there, and here's this man. And this is 1965. Ronald Reagan is 54 years old. He's this ex-actor. Pat Brown is the Democratic governor of California. He's been governor for
Did you just call me back?
2 terms. And
Oh, call me on this phone right there.
Ravages of incumbency
974
and the Watts riots and
6232.
And Pat and his people were absolutely convinced we can be reelected only if Ronald Reagan
Yeah.
is nominated.
If you can just
Republicans
go online
are
and
dumb enough to
they should have a
nominate.
section.
Well, you know, there are in the
Which one?
words
Oh, the suit.
more tears caused by answered prayers with an unanswered one.
That's the one we said, right?
And they got their prayer, and they lost by a million votes. But Reagan was like,
Hello?
Reagan was a force of nature.
Yeah, I'm talking.
At this
I
very
said the
first
sweetheart
news
package.
conference that I saw him at,
Can you hear me?
he gives a few words,
Hello?
he answers questions.
Oh.
He says that when somebody said, we don't have any experience at all, he said, well, it's good. It'll be good to have somebody in government who's looking at, taking a fresh look at this thing. But what I noticed afterward was that the reporters crowded up around him. They wanted to meet him. You see, most of them at this had seen him in films, and
Which
he had
one?
been the host,
Yeah.
not an actor, although he'd occasionally act. He'd been the host in General Electric Theater,
Oh, no, I
which
can
was,
talk
until
right now.
Bonanza came along, the most popular Sunday
just
night
one
program
trying to
in
say.
American television, ever. I mean, and before Bonanza. And so he was, in the host, he was a kind of a neutral
Oh,
person.
you
He
down
was
to the
presenting this
airport.
program. Everybody knew him. And I came back, and one of my editors asked me what I thought about him. I said, Art, I don't know a darn thing, but I don't know why
Yeah,
anybody
man,
would want
no
to run
one
against
knows
somebody
about
whom everybody knows and everybody seems to like. So Reagan was,
I
you
said,
know,
yeah,
we
fine, I'm
asked,
going to
Reagan's gift was
To
that he
the
understood that you can relate to people if you don't think too well of yourself.
Can I come?
We asked him what kind of a governor you may. I don't know. I've never played a governor, you know. And it was funny, but it was also
What did he
also
tell
a
you?
sign of the gift that Reagan had. So I wound up covering him.
Yeah,
I couldn't
you
understand
don't have
him.
to add
I
anything.
thought, well,
Just
I'll write a book
additions.
about him, and then that'll help me to understand him. Curiously enough,
What
it
did
did.
you call them?
It kept leading to, you know, I wound up writing 5 books about him. Before the second book, Reagan never took notice of that you were writing a book or anything like that. But the only time he did was he said, I understand you're writing another book about me. And I said, Governor, I'm going to keep writing about you till I get it right. I don't know
have
whether I
to do
ever
any
did.
of those.
But that's how it happened. And then when I went to work for the Washington Post, I did a lot of other things. But when Reagan ran in '76, I was the White House correspondent covering Florida. I covered the fall of Nixon, and they wanted me to cover Reagan, and I covered that campaign, and I covered the '80 campaign, and I wasn't even supposed to be the White House correspondent. I was the Western Bureau of the Washington Post, the bureau chief in L.A., and but after he won, they asked me to come back. So it just sort of, one thing led to another.
Yeah. What did you think, as governor, his strengths were? Beside the one there, his personality.
Well, his great strength, which I know better now than I knew then, because I had
You just
access to
call them?
all of the cabinet minutes of the Reagan governorship when I last was Governor Reagan, was that Reagan was very decisive.
I mean,
He
what
was
are
an
the
executive
additions?
personality. He was not a legislative.
Or maybe we should put those. How much are they?
When his backers came near the
Oh,
end of
I
the
mean-
governorship, he wanted him to run against a Democratic senator, Alan Cranston.
It's up to you. You decide.
He wasn't interested this much. He never wanted to be in the legislature, but he could decide. People would bring him something, and he would say, the best time to decide something is now, when it's before you. And some of these decisions were wrong, obviously, but he had an executive quality. The other thing was Reagan believed in certain things. A lot of things he didn't know. Sometimes he didn't know what it was he didn't know, but he had conviction, and he didn't. He was not a poll-driven governor. He was not a poll-driven.
Are those the
president.
only additions?
Poll-driven candidate, and I think people sense that. And
You wouldn't mind dancing up there, would you?
Reagan was very polarizing in California. I think he was more than it was as a presidential.
Well, if you need that number, I can give it to you. So ask questions before you do it.
There's a quality about it.
No, that's why I said talk to
I
you.
wrote that it was an more demanding. He never played a governor. It's a more demanding role than he ever expected.
No. It's fine. I don't think we need it. If we need Jews, we can.
Looking at the papers, what did you find
We can
about
just buy.
the process of the decision-making? What kinds of information he brought to him before he made decisions? Were you impressed with how that process worked?
I knew a lot about how the process worked before the papers. I knew more about the process than I did because as a reporter,
This is the guy.
I
He
always
has a lot of books.
made it
Well,
a-
a few books out
made
about
it
the
a point
Reagan
to
presidency.
cultivate people who
He used to be
prepared
reporter.
the papers and prepared the schedule and he prepared the process. And in the case of Reagan, it was the cabinet secretary, William P. Clark. Bill became his chief of staff at a crucial time. I didn't know that when I started talking to him. And he became a very important advisor to Reagan.
No, I said this is
And Bill devised
dealing
this
with the
thing.
press. He was a writer.
We sort of made fun of him
During the Reagan
mini
presidency.
memo because it was
So-
reduced to one page or.
And he was famous
said one page,
about
it actually
during
it was
that
one or
time.
two pages, and
He
it would
has a few
summarize
books,
all of the
actually.
issues. Here were the pros of doing this, and here were the cons of
I don't
doing
know.
this,
A
and
lot
I would
of
give a
people know him.
recommendation.
So
And I actually thought, even though
today.
suppose I kicked it around like everybody else did in my stories, my columns. It was a good.
I haven't yet. I was when I was busy with my finance, I was not able to call them. But I was just thinking about calling him last
Reagan
night.
often asked for
So I'm gonna call him
stuff
today.
he was interested in. But
I'm gonna call him today.
if you stated both sides and you had available people who would talk to both sides of an issue, it was really a good way for decision making. Because even, I mean, California isn't federal government, but California is the mega state. You know, 1 out of 8 people in the United States live in California. And then it was like 1 in 10, and no governor can master
Have you talked to June lately
all
about
of the issues.
the
It's
plans?
the sort of
About before.
tension that existed between the Carter
talking about
presidency and the Reagan presidency. I used to think when I started covering the White House during the, I covered it before, but during the Reagan years, it was a metaphor.
Oh, I had to go pick them
Carter
up.
had decided
Okay, well,
who would
send
play
me the
tennis
information
courts.
of where
They would
I'm
say,
going to pick
well,
them
he
up.
actually had in a few cases. No
CC
president
to my
wanted
personal
to do
email,
that.
please.
And Reagan, on the other hand, was totally big picture. He had these things that he was interested in, and he
Yes,
had
I
all
picked
these
them
other
up. I
things he
went.
wasn't interested in. And the things he wasn't interested in, he didn't know very much about or anything about,
Send me
and
the
delegated.
information.
But the things that he was interested in, he knew a lot about. And I guess in an ideal world, if we're doing this for a textbook, you'd say, well, you'd like to have some mid-range on that, but people are who they are, and I actually do think, in retrospect, that Reagan's conception of the governorship or the presidency is a sounder one than the detail, than President Carter. All I much respect President Carter, because I think you can't really know very much about what's going on in your government. You have to really decide from 3 or 4 or 5 things that you want to do and try to get to that.
And he had been interested in those same things over a long period of time, like at GE, the 1964 Republican Convention. In his Gulf Water speech, he talked about some of the things that were of interest to him.
Reagan was basically interested in, he wanted to cut taxes, which he felt were too high and had stifled the economy, and that stemmed very much from Reagan's personal experience in Hollywood, where in the first time in life he's making money, our marginal tax rates, the marginal tax rate is the rate at which the last dollar you make is taxed, were at their all-time high, and individuals couldn't income average. And he wanted to raise the defense's budget, which he felt the defense budget had gone to hell in a handbasket, in the wake of the Vietnam War, and that the Soviets would listen, but only if you could deal with them from a position of strength. And he wanted to balance the budget in the way that John Anderson, the independent candidate for president in 1980, said the only way you could do all 3 of those things is with mirrors. And President Reagan essentially sacrificed the last of the promise to carry out the 2. Well, you can argue it. I mean, from the Reagan perspective, you could say, well, 2 out of 3 isn't, is a fairly high batting average. But
did you find that it was difficult to develop sources in Sacramento in covering Reagan, and then also when going to the White House, compare that process of getting sources?
Well, I had different problems in Sacramento than I had in Washington, and they were from, for those of you who have a journalistic interest, they illustrate a couple of things in journalism, at least as it was then. In Sacramento, I represented the San Jose newspaper, which is a very big newspaper in California now. Wasn't quite as big then. It was below the level of the big battalions. And the first chief of staff that Reagan had, he wanted to talk to the Los Angeles Times and the television networks and maybe the San Francisco Chronicle. He couldn't really be bothered too often with the San Jose Mercury. So you had to work beneath the radar. You had to develop sources that weren't the chief of staff, and you know, you had to cultivate people who were in the pipeline, who knew things, but themselves were not the big cheese. In Washington, when I covered the presidency, I worked for the Washington Post, which of course was the paper that they were most concerned with. And there, the problem is not that they won't talk to you, but that they're going to try to use you a little too much as a sounding board for and a megaphone for their ideas. So there you have to, my colleague David Hoffman and I would say, well, the White House is too important to be covered from the briefing room. So there what the thing was to get away from people who didn't have the agenda of cultivating you. And it's much easier, I have to say, it's easier in Washington than it is in Sacramento, because in Washington there are 435 folks up there. They're called the Congress. And I had the good fortune to have covered the Congress in between this. And so I would call people in Congress who dealt with the White House. And there is absolutely, Martha, in my view, no magic in this. The people who do a good job in reporting are the people who make the extra telephone call. People like David Hoffman, my colleague, the late Ann Devroy, people who make that extra call the extra person, who work hard. Reporting is just hard work. It's different if you're the it's easier, I think, if you're the representative of the big battalion, but it's also you're also more vulnerable to, because they didn't waste much time trying to spin the San Jose Mercury, you know. Yeah. With the Washington Post, every day they want to spin the Post, they want to spin the New York Times, and you know the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, the big battalion.
And what kind of defenses do you set up against that?
None. I mean, I just try to go out and talk to as many people as I can, and to be skeptical without being rude or nasty or discourteous. I think that your hard edge ought to be in what you write if you're a print reporter, not what you say. I very rarely, I got in some big battles, but I hope I didn't seek them out. But there's always people, I mean, in a policy, on any issue, if you were talking about taxes or defense policy, or the budget, there are lots and lots of people who, you know, who are willing to talk about the other side of it, and you got to go out there and make sure you do that. That's all. The big enemy. I said this in this book on reporting I wrote in the dawn of time. The big failure of journalism, to me, is single source journalism, where you see a story, and you see this all the time. Next time you read a story about something that you care about, that's a long story, that's long enough to, I mean, if it's a 2-paragraph story, a single source may be okay, but in any extended story, see how many sources in there, how many points of view, how many different sides are represented, or even within, you know, the White House. I mean, how well is the Pentagon's position, or the Secretary of State's position, or the Armed Forces' position? I've seen all these stories, for instance, about the Iraq War and the question of whether or not we had enough troops and whether they were sufficiently armored. This is an issue of great importance to me. One of my granddaughters, my daughter's eldest daughter, was in the Army in Iraq and deployed there for a year. She's just recently back. Her husband was in the Marines there. Most of the stories that I saw didn't go out and talk to soldiers and Marines. You know, they talked to the two sides at a very high level. So I think you got to get, again, you use the phrase a second time, I won't use it a third, below the radar, and talk to, what's the perspective from the position of the the ordinary guy in the field. Remember the person who asked Bush that question about, or Rumsfeld the question that provoked, you got to go to war with the army you have,
Yeah,
not
right,
the army you want.
yeah.
Well, it turned out he was a great, if I got this right, he was a big fan of Bush and voted for Bush and supported him. And I don't recall seeing that very much in the stories. And the question was why, and the answer I think is a complicated answer, but that's what you need to do. You need to be sure as a reporter that you're fairly representing everyone, and if you do that, I think you're okay.
Which is, it's hard to do on the kinds of deadlines that you
Yeah,
had.
yeah.
And with the White House, you have so many stories you do during a year. Do you remember how many stories that you'd have a byline on a year when you were at the White House?
A lot. I mean, I don't know the big. They send you your clippings after, a year or two later, you get the clippings of your stories, and I think at most, I wrote something. I want to say most days of the, you're well over 300, and it isn't just what you write. One of the things that I admired about the Post, and I assume is still true, and is the stories that you contributed to, and the stories where people contributed to you. We people like David Broder, who sets this very, very high standard of everybody knows what a great journalist he is, but he also said, I thought he was a great leader within the Post because he would give you information, and so you would do that with other reporters. And some of the best stories that had my name on them had a lot of contributions and a lot of help from other people, and I hope I did that as well. The byline, I think that we're motivated by that. I think there's an ego question, but the real satisfaction is in getting the story right and getting it, and obviously we're competitive getting it first if you can do both things.
Did you find that it was more difficult, like say in the compare the Ford, Carter, and Reagan administrations in terms of getting a story? Did you find that it was any more difficult in one than the other two?
Can I, as they say, can I amend your question?
Sure.
Because I started with the White House covering Nixon, and that was really tough. That was where, when you came over the Washington Post, it became a lot tougher, and that was true. I went to work for the Post in April of 1972, which was less than 2 months before the Watergate break-in, and all of a sudden there were people. And even before Watergate became a big story, people who I thought were pretty good sources of mine who wouldn't talk to me because I had gone to work at the Washington Post, and so it became very difficult, and you had to cultivate an awful lot of people that, and sometimes you had to realize that they weren't going to talk to you, and that's really when I started talking to lots and lots of people on the Hill. Ford was an open book, not only to me, but to almost, I think, any correspondent who did even a modicum of work, because Gerald Ford had spent his life in Congress, and Ford was used to talking to reporters, and he, to be honest about it, he talked to us too much for his own good. He was never a one thing that I learned, and I don't know quite how to express it. Let me express it in this way. often you will hear when you're covering a president, because presidents are invested with so much mythology and authority, and the position is so deified, that if only Richard Nixon knew this, or if only Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush or Clinton knew this. And the truth of the matter is, it isn't that. It's the guy at the top. I knew Bob Haldeman when he was on the, Bob Haldeman, who was Nixon's ranking guy, Nixon's chief of staff. And he was considered a hard case, and the Prussian, and all of this stuff. Well, I knew Haldeman when he was on the Board of Regents of the University of California during the Reagan years, where one of the big issues was a university tuition, and so that was the Board of Regents became a political battleground between Reagan and Jess Unruh, the leading Democrat of the day. And Haldeman was a very practical guy. He worked with Fred Dutton, who was the Democratic guy, who became McGovern's guy, and they were the Board of Regents tended to be a little academic and woolly, and these guys were the political realists who got them down to ground. And Haldeman was always accessible and great, and then he comes to work for Nixon, and he's inaccessible. On my youthful my salad days, I was on the left, and people would talk about the men around Stalin. Well, we know now that it was Stalin sent these families, these men and their families, to their deaths at a whim. And we know that it wasn't the men around Nixon. It was Nixon. And so what you know is that the reason that everybody in the Ford White House tended to be honest and open with you was that that's the way Gerald Ford was. Now, Carter's a little different case. I didn't cover Carter very long as president, only 6 months as the president. I went out to the Western Bureau. Carter had different camps, and if you knew the different people, he had Ham Jordan and Watson and Stu Eisenstadt. Well, most people could connect with one of those guys, and so and Reagan had what I called a coalition government. He had Reagan was self-secure. He hired as his chief of staff a guy who had been Jim Baker, who had run his opponent's campaign. He'd run George Bush's campaign. How many times has this happened in American history? One. That's the only time it ever happened. But you had all these people. You had people who were way to the right, really, of Reagan, and you had all these people who were quite moderate, and then you had all these people in between, and you had these groups of people who were all, the leaks which drove Reagan crazy were great for us, because I had one thing that I tried to do with the Reagan White House, which I think paid off, which I actually sat down and I thought about it, was my inclination. And that was, I wasn't going to take sides among the factions. And if you look at the White House coverage in those days, if you go back and look at it, Jim Baker and Mike Deaver and the moderate did much better than Ed Meese and Bill Clark and the conservatives. And I absolutely refused to get, my goal was that I was going to, and I wasn't for any noble purpose unless you believe that giving the best coverage is itself a good purpose. I wasn't going to get involved in between them. I wasn't going to be snide toward one side or the other. I wanted to be able to get my phone calls returned from everybody, and I wanted to find out what each of them were thinking, and I think I did that. And so I maintained, I had good relations with both camps. I think they both despaired of me, but I think that was what was important in the Reagan years. There was a lot of information. Now, Nixon pioneered this business of really what they call on message and all that stuff. They didn't use it. Controlling, the White House is a funnel, and the funnel moves up like this, and the president is at the top of that, and they controlled information under Nixon in a very tight way most of the time. Where did it get him? Well, because of Woodward and Bernstein and Judge Sirica and a lot of people that got him thrown out of office. but during most of the time, it was very hard to cover them. Ford, there wasn't, kind of any funnel at all. Carter, you had these different fiefdoms. Reagan, although the communications people tried to control information, there were too many. There were just too many different camps in that administration to do it. My impression is, and a lot of this I get from Carl Cannon, who has covered both Bushes and Clinton, is I covered a little bit of Bush, but I essentially went back to California with Reagan, is that they are much tighter in controlling information today, much more effective in controlling it, much more disciplined. And my impression, I think you know this better than I, is that there are fewer divisions within the Bush White House, within this president's White House. And I know there are divisions between there were divisions between Colin Powell and Don Rumsfeld, obviously, but within the White House itself, I think this is a much more tightly disciplined and homogenous group, for better or for worse, than existed. I know than existed in the Reagan days, and I think probably than existed in Clinton's presidency too.
Yeah, I think it goes back to your point that you could say that a White House is the staff is a reflection of the president rather than a complement to him. That as much as he could go out and appoint, like if he has an area that's weak, and he could go out and bring in people who would bolster that particular area, it tends to be that whatever strength the president has, that staff has as well.
And Reagan really did want to hear different. I mean, he had his mind made up about something, but he really wanted to hear, in part because he wasn't wishy-washy. He wasn't worried that that he'd be blown away by it. He was really always willing to hear the other side. He was also, he had a curious resistance to political horse trading, which occurs all the time. Not that he didn't do it, but I remember, I don't think he'd mind me saying this, do you remember Buddy Roemer, who became governor of Louisiana?
Yes.
Who was a congressman, and I always forgotten. The story is more. I can't remember whether Buddy gave him a vote on the. I think he gave him a vote on the MX was against the Contras. It may have been the other way around. In any case, he'd given him this vote, and Reagan invites him down to the White House, and he was sort of Tip O'Neill's guy, even though he was much more conservative than Tip, and always was trying to advance the Democratic agenda. And he tried to say, well, okay, now I've done this. How about you coming along with me on this other issue? And Reagan said, oh no, it doesn't work that way, buddy. I mean, you're wrong about that. I mean, he had the ability to not just do this, you scratch my back, so I'll scratch yours, which is sort of it was in, kind of a pervasive quality in politics, although I guess considering what's going on in Washington these days, we could probably use a little more of that.
Yeah. Well, did his staff do it for him?
Sometimes. Sometimes. But I think his staff really did reflect what Reagan wanted most of the time. In 1981, Reagan said that he wanted, you had a Democratic House, and there was no way for Reagan to get his budget and his tax bills through the House without Democratic votes. You also had a number of districts in the South and West. In fact, you had a lot of districts. We always say that, but you had districts other places. Carter was, on the whole, outside of the Deep South, less popular than his party. In 1980, when Carter did worse as a incumbent president running for re-election than any president except Herbert Hoover in the 20th century. Many of the Democrats in Texas and Louisiana and some in California and other places who had been returned to office, Reagan had carried their districts, but they had been reelected. So Reagan said that if you voted for both my tax and my budget bills, I will not campaign against you in 1982. That sounds reasonable, except that's something that no one had done except FDR, and it hadn't been done for a very, very long time. And the Republican National Committee did not like it at all. I mean, they could see all these districts that they could pick off in 1982, and it was left to Jim Baker to go out there, and who was from Texas, and tell them, a lot of these guys are from Texas, and tell them, no, the president means what he says. We're not going to come into your district if you vote for the tax and the budget. And Jim's thing to the Republican National Committee was, look, we're going to get these seats anyway. We're going to get them. We may not get them in 1982, but we'll get them in 1984, we'll get them in 1986, or we'll get them. Now, Reagan didn't care about that. He didn't know when they were going to get them. He just knew that, and I think Baker would probably present it to him. But once he said it, it's sort of like Reagan said during the 1980 campaign that he was going to appoint a woman to the Supreme Court. He didn't say he was going to put the first nominee to the Supreme Court. But when the chance came, Reagan knew that President Carter had not had a Supreme Court nominee during his entire term. He didn't know whether he was going to get 2 or 3 or 1. And I remember Bill Smith, William Fred Smith, Attorney General, who was very hard to get anything out of other than he would tell you tomorrow's Tuesday or something, but he wasn't, he was always friendly. But I remember sitting at a bar with him at the Jefferson Hotel, not too far from here, when we were reminiscing about this, and he said that Ronald Reagan had made it clear to him, don't send him anybody that wasn't a woman. So their choice was, they had choices, but they were all women. Because Reagan in his mind had thought, well, he'd promised to make the first one a woman. And even though when they point out his words, you didn't say that, that was still what he thought, what he meant, what he wanted to do. And that's how we got Sandra Day O'Connor on the Supreme Court. I would argue, if that hadn't happened, whether you think this is good or not depends on your view, we would not have Roe today, because the second appointment would have been Scalia. Scalia would have been confirmed under any circumstances. These Democrats weren't and didn't going to vote against the first Italian American to be, and you'd have had the votes. You'd had the votes to overturn Roe, but you didn't.
I remember somebody from the Reagan White House said that once Reagan knew that Scalia would be the first Italian American in the court, there was no stopping that one. But he was very interested in doing that.
Yeah, there was no stopping. But Senator Kennedy, bless him, got up and made this speech, for Scalia, who is arguably to the right of Bork, whom he's he's then torching. The next time around. I mean, these guys, the congressmen with senators with significant Italian-American populations couldn't wait. They were crawling all over each other to speak up for this Scalia. He was never, I happen to think Scalia is a bright light on the court, and it's good to have bright bulbs on the court who are conservative or liberal, and that doesn't bother me at all, but he was never examined in the way that succeeding justices, both who made it or wannabe justices, were examined.
And probably the next
the next nominee will be examined. I saw this column by Bob Novak today that which is probably right, that the Democrats are already doing their. They're already vetting the whole list of 30-some potential nominees, to replace Rehnquist. I'm sure the Republicans are doing the same.
Yeah. Can you tell us what beat, of all the beats that you covered, what was your favorite?
Well, I started out as a sports writer, and I like that. I guess I'll give you two answers. I liked very much the challenge of the first 2 or 3 years as a White House correspondent in Reagan, because I was by that time a quote Reagan expert, you know, a close quote, and I'd written books about him, and everybody wanted to beat me, you know, and sometimes they did, but it was challenging and competitive, and I think I held my own, and I liked that. And the other thing I liked was being a Western correspondent for the Washington Post, because of the variety of stories. I mean, one day you might be doing a terrible disaster like the Oakland fires, and then you might be doing a political story, and you might be doing a story about a new trend in anything, you know, education, or there's a story that I did. It took me a long time to get into the paper about how they were drilling under the polar ice cap in the Bering Sea, you know, which a lot of the geologists in Alaska didn't think was such a hot idea. And stories, you could do a lot of different. You could do a lot of different. You had a lot of variety, and you had to make choices, and you were always in the West. If you work for an Eastern newspaper, you're always you get up, you know, you're on deadline, and you know, I like that.
Well, let's take some questions now from students here, and then from Towson. Towson?
I have one. What was the general feeling in the White House within the press corps during President Reagan and his, I guess, lack of presidential press conferences?
Well, I don't know that I can generalize, except President Kennedy had a thing where he was thinking, he'd always say, "Let me say this about that," you know, and give him time to think. Reagan came in after Carter had gone through a very long period of not holding press conferences. Carter really went to ground when he got into trouble, and he didn't. Americans were held hostage in Iran, and so I don't think there was as much clamor as there would have been had President Carter been holding more press conferences. Then, less than 2 months into his term, Ronald Reagan is shot. He's almost killed. For months, he is unable to hold a press conference. When he did hold Ronald Reagan became quite good at holding press conferences in California as governor. He held them every week, or nearly every week, for a very long time. By the time he held one, I've got the exact date in my books. I don't remember, but I think it was in June, or the next time he was able to hold one. He did it. It was a disaster. And after that, his staff and stuff didn't want him to hold press conferences. And Reagan himself told me when I interviewed him for my book afterwards that he himself had wanted to hold more press conferences and they always found a reason that that he shouldn't do it. There was some clamor. I think that reporters delude themselves if they think that the public much cares about their problems, and it was a problem for the press. But Reagan did do a number of things that were designed to mitigate the unrest. And he would hold series of one-on-one interviews. He would hold series of little forums under differing ground rules. So what the Reagan White House did is they often did, they would try to diffuse things before they boiled over. A lot of reporters, including me, wanted them to hold more press conferences. Can I just say to you also that I don't think a press conference is the most important measure of a president's access, because any president who's any good, and Reagan did it most of the time, and you've seen it with this guy, and you certainly saw it with Clinton, a president can control the press conference. The president decides who he wants to call on, what his format's going to be. So the press conference is really, although, you know, we want them, it's really a format for the president more often than it's a format for the press, I think.
What do you find out about a president from a press conference? Particularly the kind he had solo nighttime Eastern press conferences. So they were kind of the high wire act.
Well, you find out sometimes how prepared he is in some issue, you know, and if you are able to change the subject, how unprepared he is in some other issue. Mm-hmm. You find out a little bit about temperament and what riles him and what doesn't. I remember this awful press conference in the parking lot at San Clemente with Nixon, where David Broder observed afterward. He observed it right on the spot, and I think the polls subsequently confirmed him, that both Nixon and the press corps went way down in public estimation. People didn't like to see the press shouting at the president like that, and they didn't like to see the president out of control shouting back. But I think you get a sense of how people handle themselves. I mean, I thought Reagan was okay at press conferences, but not wonderful. I think he was a much better in one-on-one interviews than he was on press conferences. I thought Clinton was very, very good at press conferences, used the press conference very, very effectively.
Yeah, until he hit the
Monica Lewinsky wall.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, you know, that's a point, though. I mean, the point being that if you are you reach certain kinds of trouble, Watergate being the example, but you know, Lewinsky being another. Reagan's worst performances in November of '86 but it's a speech, not a press conference. You know, in Iran-Contra, if you have a position that is really indefensible, that's when a press conference doesn't help you. That's why Carter stopped holding press conferences, because he couldn't really defend their inability. He could not face these questions that repeatedly, why can't you get the hostages freed in Iran, and particularly after the military thing, you know, that you can't get them freed diplomatically or militarily. So if the situation is grave enough, a press conference is not a good idea for a president. And of course, we in the press corps want it. That's when we want it most.
Do press conference, the holding of a press conference, force policy that because they know that they're going to have to be talking about a particular bill or a policy, that it has a little more thorough discussion leading up to it?
Well, I think
internally.
Yeah, I think a press conference or a speech. I mean, either a public appearance. If you decide you're going to have you're going to explain what really happened, you know, with the Iran arms sale or anything. Obviously, that forces you to, whether it's a press conference or a speech, to prepare for it. I think a good example of that in the current presidency is the recent press conference that President Bush gave, where he really made quite a change in his Social Security proposal, and it was obvious that preparing for that press conference, you know, probably focused these guys on you know, on getting off what was the standard position that which was very general and
Yeah.
very unspecific, to saying yes, you ought to means test Social Security.
Have somebody here? Yes, Larry?
I've got the microphone, so I can ask the first. This is the first time, actually, I'm going to ask a question during the whole quarter. But I wonder if for the students, you could put into context the legacy of the Reagan presidency. That is, when he died, as a presidency scholar, I was really quite taken by the national interest and the apparent legacy that this man had captured with respect to lying in state, the week it took for his body to make it back to California, and the like. And I kept thinking back to UC Davis in 1988 and 89 and 90 when we had a conference on the legacy of the Reagan presidency, and none of us wizards could have predicted how history would come to view Ronald Reagan today. And I'm wondering if it surprises you and what factors you might give all of us to think about how history has treated Ronald Reagan to put him up to the stature of a figure that his death seems to have accorded him.
Let me try to do this in a short compass, because I want to be sure I haven't had any. I want to get some answer some questions from students. I think the most important thing to think about on the Reagan legacy is that the statement that all through the Cold War, and particularly during the last 2 decades of the Cold War, that the United States and the Soviet Union had all of these weapons pointed at each other that could destroy civilization as we know it, could make the world, would kill and poison so many people that the living would envy the dead. That wasn't a metaphor. That was a true statement. We were, you know, remember the atomic scientists and their clock, you know, I think they had us at, you know, 5 minutes to midnight or something. Reagan and Gorbachev together, and I agree with Condoleezza Rice's statement when she wasn't, before she was in this, to me for my last book, that the liberals don't give Reagan enough credit, and the conservatives don't give Gorbachev enough credit. And of course they didn't do it single-handedly, but that the two of them really saw this, not only pulled us back from the brink as Kennedy and Khrushchev did, but actually changed the whole, you know, to use the Marxian correlation of forces, you know, really reduced nuclear weapons, really. This wasn't an accident. This was something that they both believed in, that they set out to do. This is, to me, a transformational legacy, because if you don't stop and prevent, you know, nuclear war, I suppose the next great thing is going to be to prevent nuclear proliferation. Then all the rest of the stuff doesn't matter. That's the overarching thing. And I think Americans, I think the people are always smarter than politicians and publishers think they are, and I think that American people, lots of them understand that. I think that's why when Gallup does a poll, Reagan comes out that, you know, the greatest president. It wouldn't be necessarily my vote, but I think that's why. Beyond that, I think Reagan was a transformational president. Conservatives were an isolated, you know, they were a minority. They seemed to be a permanent minority when he came along. Michael Barone has made the point that there were more New Deal Democrats in the Senate in 1958 than there ever were when FDR was alive. There are a lot more Reagan Republicans in Congress now than there ever was during Reagan's presidency. And who changed that? He changed that. It's hard for me to think that George W. Bush would be able to do some of the things that he's done or tried to do, you know, without Reagan. The other thing is, and this was poll measurable, but I think we'd know it if polls were outlawed, is that if you look at the way Americans felt about themselves during 79, the year in 1980, it's in the Michigan stuff and all this data, it's the lowest that, you got to go back to when they started taking these polls. It probably was worse during the Depression, but it's a very long time that Americans have so little faith in their country or what they. And Reagan said that the thing I want to most do is to restore the faith of Americans in themselves again. I mean, his last speech, he's modest, and he's saying, he's saying he didn't do it. The people did it. Well, however you measure that, I think if you look at at how people felt about their government and their country at the end of the Reagan presidency, even with Iran-Contra, compared to how they felt in 1980, it's a huge, it's a sea change, and I think basically we want optimistic, problem-solving presidents. I think we want FDRs, we want John F. Kennedys, we want, Reagans. Which of these you want would depend upon the political point of view you have. But that's the kind of people we want as president, and I think that people feel that they had that in Reagan. Now, there's another dimension to it that I cannot quantify, which is important, though. I said this I was under contract to ABC that week, so I didn't see much of it. I was just strapped to a chair. Is that Reagan was really Alzheimer's. Most of us know people or have family members who have Alzheimer's who are not, and who are not dead but don't know us any longer or don't know people any longer. And it's a sort of, this was a great taboo which Reagan has done something, not something to change. So people never felt they had a chance to say goodbye to Ronald Reagan. He really disappeared from public view in 1994. And when he died, it was I think ABC, they called it the long goodbye, but I thought it was a late goodbye, And so I think there was a lot of emotions that you could not express, which the analogy would be if you have a loved one who has Alzheimer's or severe dementia, and after they pass away, then you can express your feelings toward that person. And I don't know how to quantify that, but I think that was an element. In the way people felt. I know it was an element in the way I felt. I was surprised. I have written all these books about him. A lot of them are very critical. And I was surprised that I missed Ronald Reagan, and I did.
Towson?
Is that on? In your coverage of the three presidents that you mentioned Nixon, Ford, and Reagan, we've heard a couple times that there was a difference between the briefings and the gaggle. Which one did you find more helpful?
I'm sorry. There's a difference between a what and a what?
The gaggle and the briefing. The gaggle came up during, I guess during Fitzwater's time, where in the morning, instead of, they moved from, at one time there was 2 briefings a day, then they moved to 1, and then they had a little thing in the morning, and Fitzwater did where he would just give the schedule for the day and that sort of thing. It became, in the Clinton administration, it became more or less 2 briefings, but it was much more informal because it was in McCurry's office.
Yeah, they used to have, actually, they used to do that in Nixon too, but the first presidential briefings the thing that I went to, was before they had the White House meeting. They were around Ron Ziegler's office. Those were we didn't even have we didn't have a briefing. We would gather around Ziegler's desk. I've always found that most of the information that I've gotten that is useful has been outside the briefing. I mean, whether it's a small briefing or a large one. I feel briefings are useful, but they're useful sort of to put out not only the line of the day, but the news of the day, the obvious, the information of the day. You know, if there's a plane shot down or something, you hold a briefing and you get your information there. But any information beyond the basic, the basic facts of some event, I always found that I needed to talk to people, and I needed to talk to them outside the briefing room. And I can't remember an important story other than some story that was an event that like the Challenger, which we witnessed, where the briefing, where I relied on the information from the briefing as my primary source. Now my memory may be wrong on that, but I think that if you're a reporter who just relies on the briefings, your readers or your viewers are in trouble. I will say that Marlin Fitzwater was excellent. I had my differences with Marlin, as he knows, but he was excellent in all formats. He was a good briefer, and he was good one-on-one, and he was a very diligent person representing, whoever he represented, any president or when he represented, when he worked for Bush and was vice president. And I always had a great respect for him. Do have a great respect for him.
What were the qualities that he had? What kinds of things did he do? You said he was diligent. What did he do? Because he was a press secretary for Reagan and for George H.W. Bush.
The worst thing that a press secretary can do, in my view, worse in some ways even than outright lying, because usually if you outright lie, somebody will expose it and you'll find it out, is to pretend to knowledge that he doesn't have. And I, like everybody else, has been led astray by briefers who did that. Marlin very rarely did that. Marlin would tell you he didn't know this, and most of the time he'd try to find it out. But at least if he told you he didn't know, you might go and find somebody who did know. There is a human tendency, and I'm thinking of 2 or 3 people now, but I'm not going to name them because I don't really think I don't like to, if I'm going to hurt somebody, or I'm going to sit down and think about it. I'm not going to just blurt it out. But who told me things, and they wanted to show that they were in the know, and they were completely out of the loop. They were completely out of the loop, and they, in the Ford presidency, I guess the most famous of this is Jerry Terhorst, who was not told about the Nixon pardon and quit, because he wasn't, he hadn't been told. Well, most of them don't quit, Okay.
From here, is there somebody who has not asked a question during the course? Here. Okay.
Yeah. What I'm wondering is, Nixon went to Whittier College, and Ronald Reagan went to Eureka College, but George Bush Sr. went to Yale, and I don't know where Ford went, and Carter went to the Naval Academy. But do you see
Ford went to the University of Michigan.
University of Michigan. Do you see in the presidents, like, does college have any impact where they went to school on how their presidents went and how they ran their administration and what their legacy is? I mean, does education and the level of education, or where you got your education, really have an impact on your presidency?
Well, I'm going to answer that 2 ways. One way is to say that I think That's a very interesting and useful question. And I would love to see somebody, my complaint against journalism is single source reporting. My complaint against political science is that they forever examine narrower and narrower topics using, regression curves and things that I don't care for. It's a very, very useful subject to investigate. I mean, in a broad way. To take presidencies over a period of time and try to answer that question. How did being a Yale man affect you, and or coming from a small place affect you? Okay. Having said that, I don't think it's what you do when you're in college. I think it's what you do when you get out of college. Reagan never made any pretense of being a good student. It drove his brother, Neil, whom he'd gotten through college, wild that Reagan would come up to a test and he hadn't studied it all. Any of you think about this, and he would cram the night before, and he had what Neil called a photographic mind, and he'd skate through the test. Reagan didn't care about that, but he learned a lot about life in college. He got interested and active in dramatics, and he in football. And if you read the good biographies of FDR, I'm thinking of Jeffrey Ward's, a first-class temperament. I don't think you can possibly come to the conclusion that Franklin Roosevelt was a good president because he had a Harvard education. He kind of skated. I don't believe that it's whether you go to Whittier College or Yale. I think the fact that Richard Nixon had an abusive father and felt a great sense of inferiority on some of the social levels is a lot more important than whether he went to Whittier College or Yale, because he had a good mind. He could have done quite well at Yale. And I think the fact that our current president licked alcoholism and is a person of faith is a much more important thing if you want to know about. One useful way to sort of look at these kinds of questions is this. Suppose you are only going to be, you can't study a whole biography, that you only can know 3 or 4 or 5 things about a president or anybody else, and you're going to have to write about them. What is it you want to know most? You know what I want to know most? I want to know most what the relationship was, if it's a man, and so far they all have been, what the relationship was with their mother. Because their mothers really, 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 really often define these guys. That's true for Reagan, I think. I think it's true in some ways for Clinton, and I think it's true for this, as President Bush says so wonderfully, mother.
Well, we are now at the end of our time. I want to thank you very much. We've enjoyed our session with you very much.
I wanted to ask, if you have a minute more, you had a question. I know you did. Is it a question I can answer really briefly, or try?
Yes, you can. Early on, you said you can relate. When Reagan was running for governor, you heard him say you can relate to people if you don't think too much of yourself. Do you believe that Reagan took that to heart in his relationships with the people that he had to deal with?
Yeah. Ronald Reagan was a classic successful son of an alcoholic, and the most successful one that I've ever known. He never he liked to make people feel good. He liked to leave you feeling good about yourself, and he
he would often say things about not being too puffed up, not thinking too well of yourself, but he didn't get close to you either. He, it was like he had this distance. He had this incredible distance, and yet people felt that they knew him and that they were talking to him. The humor is part of it. I think the humor, the self-deprecating humor, is the unrelated part of it. He would do this all the time. He would do it day in and day out. He'd do it at staff meetings. I'll end this with this one. This isn't a friend of mine who worked for Reagan, big job, and he was Reagan's first appointment secretary in California. He had a big job here, and Tom Reed, and he's once at Yosemite. They're all going out and looking up at the El Capitan, these gorgeous mountains, and Reagan says, "See that face up there in the mountain?" And all these people say, "Yeah, I see that face." And Tom says, "I can't see it, Governor." And he says, "I can't either. I just wanted to see what you'd say."
Thanks very much.